Late afternoon in Amboseli Reserve, the light had settled into the kind of muted gold that seemed to hold everything in stillness, flattening the distant hills into pale silhouettes and turning the dry grass into a brittle sea of yellow-brown blades. The wind moved lightly, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and the far-off sound of cattle bells from beyond the park boundary. But here, on this open stretch of land, the air felt heavier, as if weighted by the hour. Near the edge of a tall grass verge, Elias, a senior ranger with more than 2 decades of service in these lands, caught sight of a shape that stopped him before his patrol vehicle had even come to a complete halt. At first, it could have been the shadowed form of a resting male, but there was something about the way the body lay, pressed low, shoulders rounded, head lowered but not in the relaxed tilt of a lion at ease, that pulled his focus and would not let it go. The mane was ragged in texture, not yet the full, thick halo of an older male, but with enough dark growth around the crown to hint at maturity. Then, in the half-second where the head lifted just enough to catch the light, Elias saw the detail that closed the distance between recognition and certainty. A distinct tear along the left ear, an old wound from a snare he himself had freed the young male from 2 years earlier. That day had been one of careful patience. Working with another ranger to cut the wire without causing more harm, keeping the lion calm with distance and steady presence until the final coil had fallen away. He had watched the animal limp into the brush that day, not knowing if their intervention had been in time for him to recover fully. He had not seen him since, until now. Elias climbed down from the vehicle slowly, boots pressing into the powder-dry earth with a sound barely louder than the grass shifting in the breeze. The lion's eyes followed him, amber in the soft light, but the body did not adjust, did not tense in preparation to stand or turn away. From this closer angle, the thinness of the frame was more obvious, each rib casting a faint line of shadow beneath the skin, the hips angular and the muscle along the shoulders and flanks sunken where it should have been full. His coat had lost the depth of sheen that came from good health, dulled to a matte layer dusted with grit. Around him, the grass bent and straightened again with the wind, hiding the lower half of his body in restless movement. A slow flick of the tail brushed a small cloud of dust into the air before it came to rest. The scent on the wind shifted as Elias drew nearer, that musky undertone of lion mixed with the faint dryness of skin that had gone too long without proper hydration. Keeping a respectful distance, Elias crouched slightly, letting his own height diminish, watching for any subtle change. It was in moments like these that a ranger's decisions mattered most, not only for the survival of the animal but also for maintaining the trust of wildlife that could not be built twice. The lion's breathing was shallow. Each rise and fall of the ribs was controlled, almost guarded, as though conserving energy was the only option left. Elias scanned for signs of an external wound. No blood, no open gash, no fresh lacerations that would explain the immobility, but found none. Instead, there was a stiffness to the hindquarters, a stillness in the muscles as though standing would require far more effort than the body was willing to give. In the wild, such weakness could not go unnoticed. Rival males patrolled these territories, and if a challenge came while he was like this, the outcome would be swift. Even scavengers could become a problem if the balance tipped too far toward vulnerability. It was a simple reality here. An animal that could not move freely was an animal at risk, and risk in the wild was never static. It grew with every hour. The lion's gaze remained on him for a time, unblinking but without aggression. This was not the taut readiness of a predator guarding a kill, nor the wary look of one deciding whether to flee. It was measured observation, heavy-lidded, conserving even the effort of movement in the eyes. Behind them, the plain stretched wide, empty save for a scattering of guinea fowl moving in quick, jerky bursts through the shorter grass. Their low calls sounded briefly, almost swallowed by the stillness, but the lion did not so much as flick an ear toward them beyond a slow, delayed glance. The energy needed for sharper reactions was simply not there. Elias shifted his position a fraction, testing the lion's response. There was none beyond a faint tightening at the nostrils as he caught the ranger's scent again. He waited. In the space between their stillness was a quiet recognition, perhaps only on Elias's side, that their paths had crossed before under dire circumstances. The last time, the danger had been immediate and visible, the snare biting into flesh, the limp urgent and pronounced, the risk of losing the leg high. This time the threat was quieter but no less severe. If the lion did not rise before nightfall, the drop in temperature would slow him further, and the cover of darkness would allow other predators to approach unseen. The risk was no longer hypothetical. It was a clock already ticking. He let his gaze travel briefly across the surrounding land, noting the nearest acacia for shade, the depressions in the earth where animals had lain recently, and the faint prints leading toward a water source to the east. It was too far for the lion to reach in this state without draining what little reserves he had left. Elias knew that approaching with direct aid, a dart, a trap, a truck, might cause the lion to bolt, spending the last of his energy in panic. But leaving without some measure of action was equally unacceptable. The choice, then, was to move with deliberate patience, remain nearby, make his presence known without threat, and prepare a plan that would allow the lion to receive help without force. He stepped backward toward the vehicle, eyes never leaving the lion, his movements slow enough that the dust barely lifted under his boots. The lion's eyes followed him halfway, then closed again, his head lowering onto his paws in a gesture that was not relaxation, but simply the least demanding position to hold. Elias reached into the rear compartment for his field pack, fingers moving over the familiar contents: water containers, a basic first aid kit, and a small kit for field observation. As he worked, he kept listening for the smallest change, a shift in breathing, the sound of weight shifting in the grass, any indication that the lion might attempt to rise. Nothing came. By now, the sun had sunk low enough that its light slid horizontally across the grass, illuminating the dust in the air like faint smoke. Shadows from the acacias stretched long and thin across the ground, pointing toward the far hills. Elias knew that soon the air would cool, and the quiet would change to the rustle and call of animals moving under cover of night. If this lion remained where he was when that happened, the odds against him would grow sharply. The decision for what to do in the coming hours would need to balance both survival and the respect for a wild animal's instinct. That balance had defined much of Elias's life's work, intervening just enough to tip the scale back toward life, never so much as to take away the wildness entirely. And as he stood there, the familiar weight of that choice settled on him again, as solid and unyielding as the ground beneath his boots. Elias moved forward with the same slow, deliberate pace he had learnt over decades in the reserve, each step unhurried, leaving only shallow marks in the baked earth. The heat had begun to soften as the sun sloped lower, and the long shadows of acacia branches stretched thin across the plain. In front of him, the lion stirred, not with the sharp, instinctive motion of an animal surprised, but with the measured lift of a head that seemed to carry weight beyond its muscle. The rise was slow, the neck straining slightly before the chin leveled, and then amber eyes opened fully, finding him with a gaze that held still in the golden light. For a moment they simply regarded one another, the distance between them narrowed by something more than physical space. It was a gaze Elias knew, not merely the broad, deep-set eyes of any male lion, but the exact same look that had met him years before when this animal's life had been tangled in steel wire. The memory came in fragments, the harsh bite of the snare embedded in the lion's leg, the tense hours of keeping him calm from a safe distance, and the slow release of the last coil before the young male limped into the safety of grass. The mane had been smaller then, the frame less filled, but the eyes, steady, unblinking and alert even in pain, were the same. The wind moved across them in a low sweep, bending the grass in unison and bringing with it the scent Elias had already half expected, the musky heaviness of lion, layered with dust and a faint undertone of old blood. The animal's chest rose and fell in shallow measure, and with each lift Elias could see the slight tension in the rib cage, as if every breath came with a quiet cost. He kept his shoulders low, his posture open, and his arms loose at his sides, letting the slow advance continue until the details of the lion's condition sharpened into view. A crust of dried soil clung to part of the mane, matting the darker hair near the base of the skull. Along his flank, a narrow scrape had already begun to scab over, the kind that might have come from brushing too close to a thorn bush in haste. More concerning was the subtle swelling just above the left forepaw, where the skin pulled tight over muscle. These were not the marks of a fight's immediate aftermath, but signs of strain accumulating over days. Injuries like these did not yet rob him of movement entirely, but they could do so quickly if infection set in or hunting became too difficult. The lion's ears twitched once, angled not toward Elias but toward a hornbill's call that floated in from somewhere beyond the grass line. He made no effort to stand. The tail lay flat, its tuft motionless against the dust. It was a stillness that Elias recognized not as complete calm, but as conservation, an animal choosing to spend as little energy as possible until it became necessary to move. Yet the absence of defensive posture and the lack of growl or teeth shown at his approach suggested something unusual. A healthy male, even one without a fresh kill to guard, would normally rise or shift at the sight of a human closing in. Here, the lion held his ground without that urgency, which told Elias two things. The animal's strength was diminished, and his presence was not being treated as an immediate threat. That trust, if it could be called that, was rare, and it was fragile. Elias stopped when he was within 20 paces, close enough to hear the rasp of the lion's breathing, a faint vibration in the warm air. He did not raise his voice, speaking only once, his tone as low as the wind in the grass. "Easy now." The words were not meant to reassure in the human sense, but to maintain the calm cadence of the moment. The lion's eyes narrowed fractionally in a slow blink, a gesture that in many animals meant nothing, but in some instances of tolerated proximity could signal acceptance. It was small, almost imperceptible, but here it mattered. From this distance, Elias could better read the subtle signs of strain. The left haunch held a faint quiver, the sort that came from muscle compensating for weakness elsewhere. The breathing had a slight hitch, not quite a wheeze, but more than the usual rhythm of rest. If the lion rose suddenly, the weight would almost certainly fall unevenly, forcing him to favor one side. That would make flight awkward and dangerous, tearing at tissue that might otherwise heal if left undisturbed. The risk was clear. Any sudden exertion could tip the balance toward a downward spiral in health. In the wild, an injury that slowed a male could mean loss of territory, loss of access to food, or a lethal encounter with stronger rivals. Elias shifted one step sideways, slow enough to avoid triggering movement. He wanted another angle on the lion's body to see if there were deeper cuts or wounds hidden in the grass. The head tracked him steadily, eyes following without tension. No growl rose in the throat, no flick of the tail in irritation, just quiet observation. He knew this was not the absence of awareness. The lion was still fully attuned to him but had chosen, for now, not to act. That choice was valuable. It meant there was space to assess before the situation demanded reaction. The last light of the sun caught the mane in soft fire, each strand edging into a halo of copper and black. Elias felt the air cooling slightly, a signal that the day was nearly done. Night here was not a blanket of peace. It was movement, sound, and opportunity for predators who hunted more effectively under cover of darkness. Hyenas could smell vulnerability and would not hesitate to harass a weakened male, especially one without the support of a pride. Another male, roaming the same territory, could seize the chance to push him out, or worse. The hours ahead were not forgiving ones. If the lion could not cover ground, the risks would multiply quickly. Elias took one more step forward, then stopped. The lion's gaze broke away, turning toward the sweep of grasslands beyond. It was not a retreat, not even a sign of dismissal, but a slow look outward, as if marking the distance between here and whatever point might offer safety or food. The muscles in his neck shifted slightly with the motion, then settled again. After a few breaths, the head turned back toward Elias, the eyes finding him once more in that same steady, unblinking way. In that brief exchange there was no dramatized meaning, no imagined gratitude, just the plain fact of two beings meeting again under circumstances neither controlled. But the history between them made the moment feel weighted all the same. Elias had once been the difference between this lion's life and its loss. And now, though the threat was quieter, the edge they stood on was familiar. It would not be decided by force. The next hours would demand patience, restraint, and the willingness to act only when the balance tilted too far toward danger. For now, the lion stayed where he was. Elias stayed where he stood, and the air between them held the kind of rare stillness that only comes when neither predator nor protector is ready to break it. Elias took another cautious step forward, closing the distance until the fine details of the lion's body told a clearer story. The animal shifted slightly, rolling his weight just enough for the setting light to catch the line of his hip. And there it was, an unnatural swelling, smooth and taut beneath the skin, the kind that came not from healthy muscle but from deep bruising or a hidden wound. The mane shifted with the movement, exposing fresh marks along the flank, thin but raw, where fur had been torn away and the skin beneath scored by claws. These were not the slow-healing remnants of an old injury. They were fresh enough that the edges still held a faint, dark sheen, proof that the fight had been recent. Elias traced the likely cause in his mind, a territorial clash perhaps, or a challenge from a rival male. Either way, the toll was obvious. Every subtle movement betrayed a guardedness in the lion's frame, a hesitancy to bear full weight on the injured side. The lion adjusted his position again, just slightly, and even that small shift brought a visible tightening of muscle along his spine and the faint grimace of effort in the way his tail curled briefly before settling. His breathing held steady but carried a low, audible hitch, as though each inhalation was measured to avoid jarring the injured hip. Elias's eyes followed the pattern of scars, noting the angles. They ran high across the haunch and dipped toward the ribs, a rake from another set of claws, likely delivered in a twisting collision. In such encounters, injuries like this could worsen quickly. Swelling meant inflammation. Inflammation could lead to infection. And infection in a predator dependent on physical strength could become a death sentence within days. The air hung still for a moment, filled only with the faint hum of insects in the grass and the soft rasp of the lion's breath. Elias lowered his stance, careful not to push forward too quickly, watching for the slightest sign of alarm. But the lion's gaze stayed fixed, not with challenge but with the calm watchfulness of an animal too weary to waste energy on a bluff. His sides rose and fell, and the shape of his ribs pressed stark against his coat, telling Elias another part of the truth. Hunting had been scarce. Whether from the injury itself or the inability to compete with stronger males, this lion had not eaten enough to rebuild lost weight. Without food, his body would have little strength to fight infection, even if he avoided further injury. A gust of wind shifted the grass, and for the first time the lion's ears angled forward, picking up the movement. He tensed briefly, just enough for Elias to see how unevenly the weight was held, the front legs absorbing the strain while the back remained guarded. That imbalance confirmed what Elias already feared. Any chase, any sprint, would almost certainly worsen the damage. If he tried to hunt like this, the burst of speed needed to take down prey could tear muscle or joint. If he failed, the energy lost might not be recovered. The stakes were plain and immediate. Rest and protection might allow healing, but one wrong movement could end his chances entirely. Elias exhaled slowly, letting the thoughts settle before acting. He shifted his weight back, choosing to hold position rather than close the last few paces. Too close, and the lion might rise in reflex, burning precious energy. Instead, he let the space remain, a silent allowance for the animal to decide if movement was necessary. The lion's tail flicked once, a slow sweep through the dust, then stilled. His head dipped fractionally. Not in submission, but in the small, instinctive settling of a predator conserving what little strength remained. The sun had dropped lower now, its light thinning into a pale amber wash over the grasslands. Shadows deepened in the folds of the land, and Elias knew the approaching night would bring other predators into motion. If this lion remained in the open, the swelling, hip and slowed movement would mark him as vulnerable. Hyenas, in particular, could track such weakness over distance, harrying an injured animal until exhaustion tipped the outcome. Even a smaller predator, sensing opportunity, might test the edge of his strength. In this state, every confrontation carried the risk of a fatal end. For now, the lion did not move again. He remained in the grass, the wind lifting his mane in faint threads, the swelling at his hip stark against the curve of his body. Elias kept his gaze steady, his presence deliberate, weighing the options. The next choice would need to balance urgency with respect. Help given too suddenly might drive the lion into the very danger they sought to prevent. As the last light brushed the tops of the grass, Elias understood that the hours ahead would demand quiet vigilance. The injury was not yet beyond saving, but the margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. Elias remained still for a long moment, weighing the instinct to act against the knowledge of what that action might cost. The swelling at the lion's hip, the guarded way he held his weight, the faint scarring from a recent fight, all pointed to an animal that needed intervention. Yet the risks of immediate capture were just as clear. A dart, the sudden rush of a vehicle, or even the sight of too many people approaching could force him to rise and run. In his state, such a flight would drain what little strength he had left, perhaps tearing the injury further and tipping the balance toward collapse. If he fell out here, far from cover, the night would finish what the injury had begun. That thought settled heavily, and with it came the decision to wait. He stepped back a pace, not in retreat, but in deliberate choice, widening the gap until the lion no longer shifted his gaze with every movement. From this respectful distance, Elias could observe without pressing him toward unnecessary motion. The wind moved across the plain in light breaths, stirring the grass in patterns that revealed and hid the animal's form in turns. Every few minutes the lion's head would lift slightly, eyes scanning the horizon, then lower again as though the effort alone cost him. He did not appear to be in immediate distress, his breathing remained steady, but the stillness spoke of an exhaustion deeper than the day's heat. Elias scanned the terrain between the lion and the nearest waterhole. A narrow strip of trampled grass and hard-packed soil about 200 meters away. It was not far for a healthy male, but for one guarding an injured hip, even that distance could prove taxing. The temptation to push him toward it had to be set aside. The movement had to come on the lion's terms. Instead, Elias would ensure that when the decision to drink came, the path would be undisturbed. That meant holding his position and watching for signs of other predators, scavengers, or human disturbance. In the open savanna, such disturbances often arrived quietly, and when they did, the injured rarely had time to respond. He shifted to a low rise a short distance away, giving him a clear view of both the lion and the surrounding land. The animal's ears twitched occasionally toward distant sounds, but his body remained grounded, his tail lying still except for the occasional slow sweep through the dust. Hours could pass like this, Elias knew, with the lion gathering the will to stand. This was not passivity. It was the measured conservation of energy that often determined survival in the wild. Forcing that balance to break too soon could be fatal. The light began to thin as the sun lowered further, washing the grass in muted amber. The risk of nightfall loomed, but so did the possibility that the cooler air would encourage the lion to rise. Elias adjusted his stance, letting his gaze settle on the horizon where the first long shadows of migrating wildebeest edged into view. They were too far to be a hunting target tonight, but their movement reminded him of the other constant in these lands. Life here flowed in cycles, and the injured only survived if those cycles allowed space for recovery. If the lion could eat and drink in the coming days, the swelling might ease, and the limp grow lighter. Without that, infection and weakness would claim him. He remained there, still and quiet, a steady presence on the landscape. The lion's breathing slowed into a rhythm that matched the soft sway of the grass, and though no movement came, the decision to stay was already shaping the next hours. This was not the moment for capture or chase. It was the moment for watchfulness, for guarding a space in which strength could return. And as the sun sank, laying a final streak of pale light across the savanna, Elias kept his eyes on the lion, knowing that each undisturbed minute brought him closer to the chance of surviving the night. The first movement came with the fading heat, when the air lost its sharp glare and the grass took on the muted tones of early evening. Elias saw it in the shift of the lion's shoulders, the slow tensing of muscle as he gathered himself to rise. It was not a clean motion. His forelegs took the weight first, the hindquarters following with visible care, the injured hip resisting until a final push brought him upright. He stood still for several breaths, head low, tail hanging, as though measuring the ground between where he was and where he needed to go. The waterhole lay ahead, its shallow edge dark against the pale dust, and in the space beside it, Elias had placed a small discreet container earlier in the day, letting its contents mingle with the natural scent of the place. It was a quiet provision, nothing to startle, nothing that would alter the lion's choice to drink, only an unobtrusive addition to what the land already offered. The lion began to walk, each step deliberate, the limp pronounced but steady. His paws pressed into the earth with soft weight, leaving faint impressions that marked the uneven balance between his legs. Occasionally he paused to listen, ears angling toward distant sounds before returning to the path. Elias kept his position near the water's edge, not moving to intercept. His body angled slightly away to signal the absence of threat. The space between them closed gradually until the lion's scent reached him again. Stronger now, layered with the musk of travel and the faint metallic trace of healing skin. When the lion reached the bank, he lowered his head toward the waterhole's surface, the muscles in his shoulders shifting as he bent. Ripples spread slowly from his muzzle, the sound of his drinking faint but distinct in the quiet. Every few swallows, he lifted his head, scanning the horizon before leaning back to drink again. Elias remained still, his presence measured, the only movement the slow rhythm of his own breathing. The distance between them was no more than a few meters now, close enough that either could have closed it in seconds, yet neither did. It was an unspoken understanding, an agreement that this moment was shared but not owned. The lion's tongue drew water in long, steady pulls, each one a reclamation of what the day's heat had taken. The curve of his back lifted slightly as he shifted weight, adjusting to keep strain off the injured side. Elias noted the change, the way the swelling had not worsened since morning, a small but important sign that the decision to wait had not cost him further harm. Still, the risk remained. An injury like this, if paired with dehydration, could have pushed him past the point of recovery. This drink, uninterrupted, could be the margin he needed to survive the night. When the lion finally stepped back from the water, droplets clung to the fur around his muzzle, catching the dimming light. He stood for a moment, gazing out toward the far side of the plain where the grass moved in long, unbroken swells. Then, without haste, he began to walk again, moving along the bank before turning into the open land. Elias let him go, his eyes following until the tawny shape merged with the colors of the grass, the sound of his steps fading into the evening air. The water lay still once more, holding only the faint ring of ripples that slowly widened and disappeared. The lion had moved no great distance from the waterhole, choosing instead a patch of shorter grass where the ground was firm, and the view of the surrounding plain was clear. He lay with his forelegs stretched out before him, the injured hip resting heavily against the earth, his head lifted to watch the slow drift of evening light. It was then, as the wind shifted from the south, that Elias noticed the first shapes on the horizon, low, steady forms moving with the rhythm of lions on familiar ground. They emerged in staggered order from the taller grass, pausing to read the air, their ears catching the distant sounds of the plain. 4 females, their coats marked by faint dust from travel, and with them 3 cubs weaving between the legs of the adults. The smallest stumbled briefly on uneven soil before pressing closer to its mother's flank. Elias kept still, his eyes moving between the approaching group and the male resting before him. The lion's head tilted slightly, nostrils widening to take in the scents carried on the cooling wind. There was no rush in his posture, no rise to challenge or retreat, only the steady watch of an animal gauging familiarity. One of the females slowed as she drew near, her body lowering almost imperceptibly as she circled wide. The cubs stayed close to the others, their movements quick but contained, each glance toward the male a brief flash of curiosity shadowed by caution. The gap between them narrowed until the nearest female stopped within a few lengths of his resting place. She stood with her head high, ears forward, and the tip of her tail moving in small arcs. The male shifted his weight slightly, his injured side kept low, his gaze steady. After a long moment, the female stepped sideways, closing her circle around him. The others followed her path, not in aggression, but in a measured inspection, their bodies curving into a loose ring that left him space but acknowledged his place among them. The cubs, sensing the absence of hostility, ventured a few steps closer before settling in the grass near their mothers. Elias understood the significance of what he was seeing. A solitary male, injured and weakened, was vulnerable not only to rivals, but also to rejection from his own kind. Acceptance in this moment meant more than company. It meant the safety of numbers, the watchful presence of those who could shield him in his recovery. The risks of the coming nights would not vanish, but they would be shared. If the swelling eased and his strength returned, he might again take his place as a full participant in the life of the pride. The group settled as the light deepened, bodies lowering into the grass. Their breathing quiet and steady. The male remained upright for a time, his eyes scanning each member in turn, before he too lowered himself fully, his head resting along his forelegs. The scent of lions, layered and warm, mingled with the faint coolness of the approaching night. Around them, the plain stretched wide and quiet, the day's heat fading into the soft rustle of grass. In the stillness, the bond reformed without ceremony. Its strength shone not in sound or movement, but in the simple choice to remain together. The light had thinned to the muted glow that settles just before the first shadows of night take firm hold. Elias had remained where he was for hours, watching the pride settle into the soft movements of rest, the injured male keeping his place among them without challenge or disruption. The air had cooled, carrying with it the faint scent of distant rain, and the sound of small night insects had begun to hum through the grass. Seeing no sign of imminent threat and knowing the group would remain together through the night, Elias shifted his weight, preparing to make the slow walk back to his vehicle. Every step away from a scene like this was measured, so as not to disturb the fragile peace that had formed. He turned slightly, scanning the horizon one last time for any movement that might signal danger, then began to step back along the path he had taken earlier. It was then that the sound of movement reached him, a soft crunch of grass, steady but uneven. He turned his head and saw the male rising from his place, the pride watching but not moving to follow. The lion's weight shifted heavily onto his forelegs, his hindquarters slow to straighten, the injured hip carrying its burden with each step. He moved deliberately, not in the quick, silent gait of approach, but in a slow, measured crossing of space. Elias remained still. his body angled slightly aside to avoid making the meeting feel like a confrontation. The distance between them closed, and the scent of the lion, warm, musky, edged with the dry dust of the day, grew stronger. The lion stopped just beyond arm's reach, his breath visible in the cooling air. For a few seconds, they stood facing one another, neither moving further. Then, with a subtle motion, the male lowered his head, not to the ground but enough to bow it slightly in Elias's direction. It was not the exaggerated dip of submission, nor the wary crouch of a threatened animal. It was a brief, deliberate lowering before he straightened again, his eyes meeting Elias's for a final moment. The gesture was small, yet it carried the unspoken weight of recognition, a rare moment of stillness between wild and human in which neither role was diminished. Elias let out a quiet breath, the only sound between them the faint rustle of grass in the wind. He knew not to step forward, not to close that last gap. The lion had made the choice to bridge it himself, and that choice was its own form of trust. A few moments later, the male turned back toward the pride, his limp still present but his movements steady. As he returned to his place among them, the fading light caught the line of his mane, turning it to muted gold. Elias stood until the shapes of the lions blurred into the long grass, the quiet bow still held in his mind long after they had disappeared from view. The first light came softly, spilling across the savanna in pale gold that pushed the night back into the folds of the land. A cool breeze moved through the grass, carrying the sense of damp earth and distant herds. The pride began to stir, their movements unhurried but purposeful, bodies rising one by one from the shallow impressions left in the ground where they had rested. The injured male lifted his head last, blinking against the brightness. For a moment he stayed as he was, the memory of yesterday's strain still written in the careful way he shifted his weight. Then, with a measured push, he rose to stand. The limp was still there, but it was lighter now, his balance steadier than it had been when Elias had first seen him. The females moved ahead, their shapes long against the low sun, while the cubs stayed close, weaving between them in bursts of youthful energy. The male followed, keeping pace without pressing forward, his head held a little higher than it had been in days. The swelling at his hip no longer forced him to tilt his body awkwardly, and though each step carried the memory of injury, it was clear he could travel the open plain without faltering. The line of the pride lengthened as they set out, their path curving toward the broader grasslands that would take them back into the heart of their range. Elias watched from his place near the rise, his eyes following the rhythm of their progress. He noted the evenness of the male's breathing and the way his tail flicked occasionally at flies but no longer hung entirely still. These were small signs, but they mattered. Out here, survival often turned on such details, on the difference between moving with the herd and falling behind. The risk was not gone. A single confrontation with a rival could undo this fragile recovery. But today, the balance had shifted back toward life. As the pride crossed into the taller grass, the cubs vanished and reappeared with each leap and bound, their small forms swallowed by the landscape before breaking free again. The females cast occasional glances toward the male, not in challenge, but as if confirming his place among them was secure. The sun climbed higher and the light deepened, warming the colors of their coats until they blended almost seamlessly with the land around them. Elias stayed until the shapes ahead thinned into the horizon, the last trace of the male's mane dissolving into the sway of the grass. The sound of their passage faded, leaving only the low breath of the wind. He turned at last toward his own path back, the image of the lion walking with his pride, a little stronger, a little surer, settling quietly into memory.